Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Front Page by AM Network. I'm Antara. Today we are talking about a shift in the pharmaceutical industry that quite honestly sounds like a bit of a science fiction, but it's happening right now in Bhubaneswar. Normally when we talk about space technology, we'll focus on satellite, internet, defense or Mars rovers. But today we are looking at how low Earth orbit might solve a problem sitting inside our hospitals. On Earth, gravity constantly interferes with how chemicals mix and how protein crystals grow, making some life-saving drugs less effective and much harder to administer. A Bhubaneswar-based startup named Serendipity Space is trying to change that. They, in fact, are building reusable satellites equipped with autonomous chemical factories to manufacture pharmaceuticals in microgravity. In fact, recently they took a major step towards that goal, successfully testing their autonomous drug crystallization system, which I believe is called Alchemy, during a near-space mission launched from the TIFR balloon facility in Hyderabad. Joining me for the hour is CEO and co-founder of Serendipity Space, Antariksh Parichha. Welcome to Front Page, Antariksh. How are you doing?
Hi, Antara. Very nice to meet you, and thanks for having me.
True pleasure, Antariksh. And whatever you're doing, it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, we have to start with the origin story here. You know, the leap from really looking at a cancer ward to deciding the solution is building a spacecraft by itself is massive. So, Antariksh, take us back to the beginning. What is it that made you believe that pharmaceuticals could actually benefit from being manufactured in microgravity?
Right. I'm not from the pharmaceutical background, obviously, but I had seen this drug called Keytruda being administered all across the world, obviously, and in fact, with some of my close relatives as well who are undergoing treatment. And when patients go to the hospital, they often end up using being in the hospital for like 4 to 5 hours to get the drug administered because it's an intravenous injection. But I was doing research on that just out of pure curiosity about why is this drug so expensive, why is it so successful, and I stumbled upon a paper that was published in Nature by Mach. Mach is the parent company that makes Keytruda, and they had also noticed the same problem that patients are the hospitals ecosystems are under tremendous pressure because these drugs take a very long time to get infused into the body, and 4 to 5 hours per patient, which means that a bed will be only occupied by like 2 patients in a day, and that's a very bad ratio for hospitals to manage. So Merck actually went out and tried to make a subcutaneous version of the drug, which means that people will be able to sit at their home and take it like a insulin shot, something like you don't need to go to the hospital for that. You can just sit at home and administer it yourself. But while making that, the way to do that is to actually make crystals of the drug. But when you make crystals of anything, on Earth, they actually usually face defects on Earth due to sedimentation, convection, and buoyancy. These are like the fundamental forces that are there on Earth. And the moment you actually switch these things off, you end up getting much better drug crystals. So I stumbled upon the paper in which they had tried to manufacture Keytruda in ISS, International Space Station, and they got some stunning results as well, where they could actually convert it from an intravenous injection to a subcutaneous shot, and which can be a massive improvement in patient outcomes as well. So that's where I got the idea. But how the stuff, how the crystallization and drug research happens in space right now is with astronauts, which means that it ends up costing a lot of money and also a lot of time. And so the idea was naturally that at the root of the problems of why this has not happened at scale in space is the human. And that's where we got the insight to actually build autonomous factories which can go to space, make these things and come back down.
All right, interesting, Antariksh. So would you say that that is that specific pharmaceutical problem that becomes fundamentally, I would say, easier to solve in space rather than just building a better and more expensive lab on Earth?
Yeah, so I mean, I have been asked this question that can you create something of a microgravity environment on Earth? And the thing is that you can build any machine which can go up to 1,000 of Earth's gravity, but not lesser than that, not beyond that. And usually the drugs that are the most important ones, like cancer drugs and chronic ailment drugs, they actually experience a good enough shift only beyond 10 to the power minus 3, or attaining like microgravity. So that is something that you cannot achieve on Earth no matter what kind of machine you make, because Earth's gravity will not allow you to. So the answer was that, I mean, we would have been the first ones to actually do this if it was possible on Earth, because going to space is also a tough affair, and coming back is an even tougher affair.
100%.
But the only way to do that was to go to space.
All right. Antariksh, decades of research have gone into microgravity pharmaceuticals on the International Space Station. What really convinced you that a commercial startup could make this option viable now?
Right. I think a couple of things, I mean, very specifically, two things happened in the past 4 to 5 years. We saw more and more breakthroughs in pharmaceuticals in the ISS. So not only Keytruda, there were multiple other drugs from multiple other Big Pharma that had at least flown to the ISS like 3 to 4 times to get these drugs crystallized and returned to Earth.
Yeah.
And that was the signal that pharmaceutical companies were actually increasing their adoption of space in doing this. At the same time, something like 10-15 years ago, the cost of sending something to space was at $25,000 per kilogram, and now it's down to like $3,000 to $5,000 per kilogram. And this means that suddenly the unit economics almost matches the same unit economics on Earth for doing these kind of pharmaceutical manufacturing missions in space, which is why I thought that it was the right time to take this forward.
All right. Antariksh, I do have a sort of a follow-up question on that. There is a massive graveyard of, space startups that try to commercialize ISS research. Why would you say is the timing right in 2026 for a seed stage company to take this on?
One of the main reasons was that ISS had plenty of research, not only on pharmaceuticals, it had research on fiber optics, semiconductors, metal alloys, bunch of other stuff manufactured in the ISS. But it is very important to pick the right candidate for commercialization. Like which of these technologies or which of these industries are ripe for microgravity to enter its domain. And purely, if you look at these industries, you would understand that the only sort of like the first use case that is bound for success is something that has a very high dollar per kilogram value. So if you manufacture something in space, it has to have economic returns which are actually very high. And if you compare semiconductors, metals, and pharmaceuticals, for example, pharmaceuticals always win. And because the dollar per kilogram value for those substances, drug substances, is much higher than any other material, because naturally it saves lives.
Understood, Antariksh. I'll shift the conversation here slightly. Moving a chemistry lab to orbit isn't just about rockets, right? It's about automation. Now you are building Alchemy, which I believe is a factory that has to operate completely independently in one of the harshest environments possible. How much better are these crystals you are producing in microgravity as compared with the conventional crystallization here on Earth? Do you have any actual numbers that you could share with us, or are you seeing any structural differences between the two?
Right. I think the main things that you see when you crystallize these drugs in orbit is that specifically with relation to crystals, you end up getting a very uniform particle size distribution of all these crystals, which means that on Earth, if you make it, there will be very large particles like 200, 500 microns, and some are maybe like 50 microns, 60 microns. So you have both of these species, right? But when you do it in microgravity, you end up getting a singular particle size distribution, which means that all of the crystals will be like 50 microns or something like that. Right? Now, this has a good effect, for two reasons. One is that you have to have all the crystals which are of the same size for any drug to be even approved, right? Because if you have different species, then you have different dosages, it's a problem. The second thing is that if you have uniform particle sizes, you also have lower viscosity. So on Earth, if you make these drugs, they become too viscous, and they ultimately cannot be injected under the skin. But the moment you make them in space, their actually viscosity reduces because of the uniform particle size. And so you can play around with formulations a little bit to actually make it less viscous and then inject it under the skin.
All right. Antariksh, what is the first drug or molecule where you believe Serendipity Space can demonstrate a result that cannot realistically be achieved on Earth? Do you think there is something like that?
Yeah. So we are working across both sets of molecules, biologics and small molecules both. Biologics are protein therapeutics and small molecules are synthetic drugs, right? So we are working across both the drug classes. We do believe that I think biologics has a good opportunity to actually get some novel formulations made in microgravity. And the reason is that many of the drugs that are currently on the market for cancer, psoriasis, and a bunch of other diseases are monoclonal antibody therapeutics. And monoclonal antibodies are very notorious to crystallize. They often don't crystallize on Earth, and even if they do, they are not controlled. So you can't control the crystallization. But the moment you reduce gravity, you actually end up getting a control over that, which means that most of the monoclonal antibody drugs which are there on the market right now, we'll try to push them from an IV to a subcutaneous route for patients, so that we reduce the burden on hospitals and it becomes a better patient experience. And also, hopefully, the cost goes down, because there's a lot of ancillary cost associated with these drugs because of hospitals, administrators, clinical administrators, and a bunch of other stuff.
All right, interesting. Between the microgravity processing itself, the AI and autonomous operations of your module, or would you say the violence of atmospheric re-entry, what is the hardest, technical problem that you are solving right now?
Right. So there are two difficult issues to sort of attack. One is that you need to, till we get to a point where we are flying to space every month, we need to choose our horses very carefully, which means that we need to do very, very good analysis on Earth to be sure which one is going to work in space. So that's what we try to do with most of our time on Earth, right? So once that is fixed, the autonomous factory basically is, you'll just load the raw materials and you ship it to space, and it basically starts autonomously producing these crystals. But while returning, you actually experience quite high speed of return. So, typical re-entry speeds are like Mach 25, which is 25 times the speed of sound, and you end up getting tremendous amount of heat generated, something like 1500 to 2000 degrees Celsius. And what your job is actually protect the satellite when it's coming back. So we have done tests on whether these crystals, survive such violent, acceleration forces, and we have engineered our system according to that as well. That they'll be fine, and we have done those tests. Right now, what we're doing is pushing the heat shield, manufacturing to the point where we can survive the higher temperatures of re-entry.
Okay. Antariksh, as far as autonomy is concerned, if a valve sticks or a temperature sensor fails on Earth, a lab tech fixes it. Now, if it happens 400 kilometers up, I would say the mission is over. So if you could give us some details about how are you designing the software and that autonomous system to sort of self-correct it in the orbit itself. If you could give us some details.
Right. So the pharmaceutical factory will be capable of monitoring the crystallization process as well as controlling, not only controlling. So we need to actually see what's being manufactured and what sort of crystals we've gotten, and do some detection of that. So the way to fix these, some of the potential, risks is that one is redundancy. So you end up having multiple, smaller components, such that if one fails, the other can take over, and we can have the process continuing as well. So one of the ways to do it is to have redundant systems, and the second approach is to make your payload as passive as possible. So which means that even if all your sensors fail, right, you should have a structure which actually maintains the temperature or maintains the processing ongoing without any problems and without any requirement of electricity, let's say. So we have also taken quite a good amount of effort to making the payload as passive as possible, such that even if all our systems fail, we should be able to do the basics right.
Understood. Antariksh, a couple of weeks ago, your company went viral after a successful near-space test using a stratospheric balloon out of Hyderabad, I believe. I want to separate, the hype from the hardware and really understand the business model here. What exactly did the Alchemy module manufacture during that, near-space flight, and what did you physically bring back to the lab?
Right. So this mission was to test all of our core subsystems. So we have multiple subsystems, right? We have the heat shield systems, we have the deployment systems, we have avionics, telemetry, pharmaceutical factory, and the heat shield itself, all of these things together. So the idea was to use this mission to push all of our technology readiness levels to like TRL 6 or 7, right? Just with this one mission. So that we know that something works at a temperature and air pressure which is very close to what actual space will have, right? So that is what the main goal was. And in this process, we also ended up, basically running the factory. We had drug crystals, we had commercial therapeutics on board, and these are drugs currently on the market as well. We had proteins, small molecules, as well as monoclonal antibody therapeutics, in which we had these crystals actually return from this mission, and also survive the landing as well, because we landed at a low velocity because of deploying parachutes. So we actually could also demonstrate that, okay, we can attain a soft landing, and then we basically harvested the crystals out and we analyzed them in our labs, and they're fine.
All right.
They're intact as well.
That certainly is a fantastic way to go about it, Antariksh. Also, what is it that this high altitude flight definitively prove? That you hadn't been able to prove in a ground lab, and also crucially, what remains unproven at the same time before you have a working orbital factory?
Right. So this was what we call an orbital class satellite prototype, so which had all the necessary subsystems, right? Except the propulsion system, I think we had all the subsystems which were a prototype, class that we had tested. That how to do the basics in space, right? Because be it 30 kilometers or be it 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers, you would use the same telemetry, telecommand, software. You would use the same, protocols, etc. So a lot of the stuff that we could test was that we could reliably control our factory during this journey, because obviously there's no contact apart from the telemetry, telecommand. And that was the most important part, where we could change the temperatures, change the mixing rates and crystallization rates, all of these things. We could ensure sitting on ground, and that was very important. And the second thing is that, on ground, we could test it in a thermovacuum facility, and we did that as well. But then all of the subsystems, how they actually perform in space, is something that, we wanted to do ourselves anyway. Because although you could get a replication of that in a thermovac, we did want to see how communications worked, how actually our materials are surviving, and how do parachutes deploy, and how do we land safely back. So
Understood. Antariksh, let's also talk business here. Who is the eventual customer? Will massive pharma companies, pay you to act as an orbital contract manufacturer, or do you see Serendipity, eventually owning the IP really and becoming a pharmaceutical company in itself?
Right. So to start with, we look at ourselves as basically like a formulation development company for pharmaceuticals. So a lot of pharmaceutical companies have multiple candidates which are in the pipeline, right? And these candidates end up facing a lot of issues with solubility, with bioavailability, and a bunch of other, drug parameters, which hopefully microgravity can solve. And so we become the gateway for them to actually have a new physical environment to try to make their drugs in. And so essentially we have an effect on how they move from, which is a small molecule, like just a molecule, to something that is ready for clinical trials. So that's where we sort of act as, and our primary customers are pharmaceutical companies in India and abroad.
Okay, understood. Antariksh, a stratospheric balloon gives you extreme conditions, right? But it doesn't give you sustained microgravity like orbital freefall. So does this test actually validate that chemistry, or just validate the hardware durability of it?
So when you drop from something, you have a small amount of time in which you are undergoing free fall, right? And that free fall is what you use to do something. But of course, without getting to orbit, you actually don't get like days or weeks of microgravity, which is what is typically required for these crystallization processes, right? So we did run the factory and everything, but there was a small amount of time in microgravity that we eventually got. While it was not a necessity that we have to manufacture it using a stratospheric balloon drop, because we didn't expect it to, basically we didn't expect days or weeks of microgravity to be there, because it's just a balloon drop. We tested all the core subsystems that are required for an orbital launch. And now, once we ship something to orbit, we'll be able to operate them exactly as we did right.
Okay, all right. Also, what is the absolute maximum cost per kilogram threshold your commercial missions need, to hit before pharmaceutical companies actually start buying your services?
I don't think we operate in a typical dollar per kilogram model, because we are set up more like a pharmaceutical company than a space company in some sense. So we actually take, essentially contracts for developing these drugs, because it's not
Okay.
only as simple as sending or shipping something to space and bringing it back, because we have to also run the process before going to space, which means that we have a pharmaceutical company which actually works with the drugs, for a long time before sending it to space, because we need to know exactly what we're doing. We develop the crystallization processes ourselves. We know which process will work with which drug, what are the setbacks that can occur, what are the positives that we can exploit in space. All of these, things have to be researched before going to space, which is what we have set up for. So in a nutshell, we actually end up almost acting like a CRO or a CDMO would do, where they would take these drugs and then they would conduct the basic research to actually tell you that, hey, this is how we're going to manufacture it. This is how much it's going to cost ultimately. And so it's not about $1 per kilogram value, but as a contractual value to develop a drug.
Okay, all right. Antariksh, I also want to talk about this new space race in India. Now, building hardware that goes to space and then comes back safely has historically been the domain of nation and states, and not typically startups incubated in Bhubaneswar. You are building reusable satellites with inflatable heat shields and guided re-entry capabilities in-house. Why take on that massive engineering challenge instead of treating orbital infrastructure as a commodity that you can rent?
Great question. I think the answer to the question is that we can't rent a commodity that doesn't exist. Very simply put. Right, and there does not actually exist any vehicle that can, or an autonomous, real estate in space that we can rent out. We would happily do so if there was something like that existing.
Okay.
And the ISS is one of them, right? But then the access to the ISS and repeated cost and cadence is something that exactly what we're trying to solve, which is actually a bottleneck in drug manufacturing. So it doesn't make sense to go to the ISS, traditional ISS route. Instead, build the vehicle ourselves. We also realize that if we don't own the entire chain of this entire process, we also don't end up capturing the entire value. So this means that the pharmaceutical customers are not going to make their own payloads or like autonomous factories which are space qualified, right? Obviously, they're not going to do that. And they're also not likely to develop the crystallization process or formulation process themselves, because they don't know how things work in microgravity. Right? That's some data that we will have. And number 3 is that if we also end up renting out infrastructure or outsourcing the manufacturing of the satellite, we cannot ensure any quality assurance with what goes to space, what comes back. And so a lot of that risk is transferred, which is actually a bigger risk for us. So we plan to have the entire chain. So we are building the vehicle ourselves. We will re-enter, and we will also have the factory in it. So I don't think it's a major thing to address, because it's something that's necessary, to do.
That you're being modest here, but all right, Antariksh. Then, having said that, Antariksh, could India realistically become a hub for in-space manufacturing, or will the most valuable part of this ecosystem eventually move to the US and to the Europe?
I think in my discussion sometimes with people at InSpace and ISRO, we do agree on a common point, which is that, look, for things like reusable rockets and other existing technologies in the US, which US has almost monopolized right now, India does have a good chance of it, and we should definitely go ahead and do it. But the emerging markets of space is something that actually we do have a big chance in actually conquering. Right, and in-space manufacturing is one of them. There are not a lot of companies doing this around the world. Even there are, a handful, maybe like 4 to 5 companies around in the world that are doing this seriously with the market focus, abroad. So we thought that this is something that India can take a lead once we fix. And the good thing is we also have expertise in re-entry. Only 4 nations have actually re-entered a space capsule from space and landed it back safely. Back to Earth, and India is one of the 4 nations to actually have done it. Long back, but we do have the expertise. So we thought that the right units exist. We just have to put them together.
Okay, all right. Also, Antariksh, what does the Indian tech and venture capital ecosystem really need to change for deep tech hardware companies to really move from prototypes to, I would say, repeatable commercial missions?
I think Indian venture capital is actually doing a pretty good job already to
Okay.
start with. If you compare it like maybe like 5 years before, our time when space was just privatized, right? I think they're at a much better level where they are willing to take risks that even somewhere in the world might not. Like UK might not, Europe might not, but India might just take up the risk, which is visible with us as well. I mean, we also got funded, and I was not expecting that. Okay, it'll be like I was expecting a lot of ridicule, but I think VCs did have a sense of exploring that. Okay, what is it exactly that you're doing, and they didn't pass it off as something ridiculous.
Okay, so you
I
said
do
that
think
there was
that,
no
of course,
apprehension per se.
no, I mean, ultimately, you can choose to let the deal go by or something, depending on what you think of the idea. But they didn't ridicule the idea as in like, oh, come on, you guys can't be serious, right? There was no
Okay,
reaction like
all
that
right.
from Indian VCs, which is what I loved, because they were like immediately the moment I pitched it as a serious idea, they were considering it as a serious idea as well.
Okay.
But apart from that, of course, there needs to be more capital infusion, and that is, I think, every founder will tell you that, because the scale at which US operates or Europe operates or UK operates, they have enormous capital flowing in. So India does need to have that, and I think we are seeing a trend in that rising, and hope it continues.
All right. Antariksh, you, I believe, met the Prime Minister recently, I believe just last Friday. Tell us something about that conversation. Did that conversation give you the confidence that regulatory bottlenecks for private space recovery in India are actually being dismantled? Did it go along those lines?
Absolutely. I mean, it was a great meeting, and Prime Minister Modi is very sharp in actually understanding something just right off the bat. So he immediately got what we were doing, and he's talking about APIs and stuff like that. I was like, okay, great. So that was something very cool for us to see. So it was a very enthusiastic meeting for all the space startups to go ahead and do whatever we want. Most importantly, also, I think policy is keeping up now, because we have the first guidelines of re-entry published by InSpace as well. I think that was a great step in the right direction for actually making India ready for re-entry capabilities, right? And landing satellites on its own soil. I think that was a major policy win to start with, and we will be seeing more versions of that re-entry policy come into existence as well very soon. And the good thing is also that when Serendipity talked to InSpace and a few other ISRO personnel as well, we always pitch it as, look, this is a new economy that can be created for India. We're not talking about ourselves here. Like, yeah, sure, we'll be able to land a satellite maybe in like Run of Kutch or like Ladakh or something like that. But ultimately, if you are able to make a policy where others can also land the satellites, you are actually generating a new economy in India. Because once they land their satellites here, they will do all the analysis, testing, all of their vehicles in India. So you will actually see a birth of a new range of startups, new range of services actually. So India can become the re-entry corridor of the world. And that's what our pitch was. And that's the reason that new policy needs to exist, not because we want to do it. We can re-enter anywhere. We can re-enter and land in Kazakhstan. We can re-enter in Australia. That's okay for us. But India taking the strategic route is important.
Okay, absolutely. Serendipity Space is essentially attempting a fundamental rethinking, I would say, of the global supply chain. Now, if low Earth orbit becomes a space, or I would say a place where we manufacture superior medicine, it would essentially bridge these two industries, right? Aerospace and biotechnology, and which used to exist in completely different universes. Now, whether space becomes the next standard factory floor for Big Pharma remains an open question. But as hardware costs drop and autonomous systems evolve, that line between earthbound technology and orbital manufacturing, I would say, is blurring faster than ever. So tell us something about this, Antariksh. How did you really come about it in the first place? I mean, this is something that has not been attempted before, as you mentioned. This is something that people wouldn't even have imagined, let alone attempted. They wouldn't have even imagined in the first place. So while you tell me that VCs were actually encouraging about it, there was no apprehension per se, but I would say there was still maybe some sort of back and forth. So take us through that, like give us like some, path into your brain. How were you thinking about it? How did you even imagine that something of this sort could be attempted at such a scale at that?
Right. So, I mean, it was pretty simple. So, I was back in Europe back then. I was doing my master's, and I was reading up about these kind of the ISS research basically. And I stumbled upon these papers that basically talked about a lot of these drugs being manufactured there. And I ultimately thought that, okay, I am very close in proximity to these pharmaceutical companies in Europe. So, I should maybe take a train and just go and meet them or something, right? So, I just used to go there and meet the principal scientists of big pharma companies. And I ultimately asked them that, hey, you clearly have gotten great results. Why haven't we done it? Like, why haven't we seen a drug on the market yet, which has been manufactured in space? And they went on a 1 hour rant, right?
Okay.
And this 1 hour rant eventually became Serendipity because they basically said that, look, we want to do this. It's costing us like $50-60 million every couple of weeks. This is tremendously expensive. And also, whenever we want to send something to space, we don't get it. It's almost always that you have to align with astronauts' timelines. So whenever they go, you send something. Whenever they come back, you get the thing back. So it does not exactly match with the pharmaceutical companies' timelines. So I was like, great. So at the both of the roots of both of these problems were the humans. And I was like, okay, if you did have an autonomous factory that could do this, they're like, yeah, that would actually work. And that was when I realized that, okay, some customer sort of respite actually was what I sensed. And I was
Fair.
like, okay, this is something to go out and build.
Okay, fair. Antariksh, what is next? What is next in your pipeline?
Next is orbit. We tested the core subsystems. We are exploring now a few launch opportunities, in India, abroad, to actually launch our pharmaceutical factory to space. And then that will be our first, sort of like orbital mission, and followed by successful re-entry as well in the next orbital mission as well. So we want to spread these two engineering challenges out over two orbital missions.
Okay.
So ultimately, by end of 2027, Q1 2028 is when we want to have the first commercial mission to space and then return and land safely back in India.
Okay. All the very best for that then, Antariksh. I think this has been a very, very intriguing conversation. Thank you so much for your time. In the interest of time, again, we'll have to wrap this segment, but this is absolutely unheard of before. So what you're doing there, all the very best for your future endeavors on that. And ladies and gentlemen, whoever has tuned in right now, thank you for watching. This was Antariksh Parichha joining us and taking us really inside the tech. So thank you all for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comment section. This is Front Page by AM Network. We'll see you soon again.